There's something quietly haunting about the people who grew up in the 1970s. A kind of strength that isn't loud, a kind of independence that doesn't need to be announced, and a way of navigating life that feels almost foreign to the generations that came after them. Because everything about the 1970s was designed to shape a different kind of mind. Not through intention, not through therapy or education or structured parenting, but through raw, unfiltered childhood experience. It starts with something small, something most people overlook. The unspoken rule of the era: you were on your own more than you realized. It wasn't neglect, it was normal. You woke up, ate a bowl of cereal, and disappeared into the world until the streetlights flickered on. There were no phones, no check-ins, no hovering parents observing your every move. The neighborhood itself was your supervisor. Your friends were your counselors. Your instincts were your guide. But here's the dark part. When no one is telling you what to do, you learn fast. You learn what feels safe and what doesn't. You learn who you can trust and who you should avoid. You learn how to sense danger before it arrives. Psychologists now call this environmental hyper-awareness, but 1970s kids just called it going outside. Picture yourself at 8 years old, pedaling your bike 3 streets over because you heard someone built a new ramp from old plywood behind the abandoned lot. No helmets, no adults supervising, no safety guidelines. Just you and a handful of kids daring each other to go faster, higher, further. And when someone inevitably wiped out, it wasn't a crisis. It was a calculation. You figured out what went wrong, you dusted yourself off, and you tried again. Or you didn't. But the lesson was yours. The dark psychology behind this is simple. When children are allowed to test the edges of their own limits, they don't grow fearful, they grow calibrated. They become experts at interpreting risk, not through warnings, but through experience. Their intuition becomes rooted in reality, not imagination. And this intuition stayed with them into adulthood. Now imagine the afternoons after school. You walk into an empty house, the door closes behind you, and the silence is almost physical. There's no noise, no parents asking about your day, no one reminding you what to do. Just that hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of a clock on the wall. This wasn't loneliness. It was training. Training in self-reliance so deep it became subconscious. You learned how to handle that silence. You learned how to make your own snacks. You learned how to turn on the TV yourself, start your homework yourself, and keep yourself company. Modern psychologists call this building an internal regulatory system. 1970s kids just thought they were killing time until dinner. But that quiet independence created something else, something subtle and powerful. You formed a relationship with boredom that today's world almost can't comprehend. When you said, "I'm bored," your parents didn't panic or hand you a device. They didn't design a structured activity. They didn't fill your time for you. They simply said, "Find something to do." That sentence, that simple push, rewired your creativity. Because when you're forced to sit with boredom long enough, your brain starts creating. Imaginary games, makeshift inventions, elaborate story worlds that lived only in your mind. You learned that boredom wasn't something to escape, it was something to explore. And this built a strange kind of resilience. The ability to live inside your own mind without needing constant stimulation. A skill most adults today lost before they ever learned it. Now fast forward again. You're outside with a group of neighborhood kids playing a game that doesn't have a name and doesn't need one. Someone gets mad, someone cheats, someone cries, someone threatens to go home. And you, without even realizing it, are learning micro lessons in human behavior. You're watching the smallest changes in tone, the tension in someone's shoulders, the way one kid tries to dominate the game while another tries to disappear. You're absorbing it all without a single adult stepping in, without a teacher mediating, without anyone telling you how to interpret these moments. And that's where the dark psychology begins to take form. You become an observer, a reader of people, a decoder of human motives. Kids who grow up without constant adult referees develop far sharper social instincts. They learn conflict resolution through trial and error, not instruction. They learn that words aren't always honest indicators of emotion. They learn that groups form hierarchies and alliances, that friendships shift, that dynamics can flip in a moment, and you must adapt with them. These micro skills harden into emotional intelligence, not the soft therapeutic kind, but the street-level kind. The kind that notices when someone's lying before they've finished their sentence. The kind that senses when a conversation is about to explode. The kind that instantly reads a room and understands where you fit inside it. This psychological tuning stays for life. And then there were the weekends, those long, empty stretches of time when no one was around, no planned playdates, no back-to-back activities, no constant validation buzzing through your pocket. Just you, pacing through a quiet house or wandering the neighborhood alone. And here's where something profound happened. You learned to enjoy your own company. Not tolerate it, enjoy it. People who grew up in the 1970s built an internal world rich enough to keep them entertained. They didn't equate solitude with sadness. They didn't panic at silence. They could sit on a porch for hours with nothing but their thoughts and feel completely fine. This self-containment is a psychological superpower in adulthood, especially in a world drowning in distraction. But the deeper truth, the darkest part of the psychology, formed in the moments of failure. Failure back then wasn't softened. You lost the game, too bad. You got a C, try harder. You fell off your bike, get back on. There were no emotional crash mats, no adults rewriting reality so you wouldn't feel bruised. And because of that, these kids learned something that's becoming increasingly rare. Failure doesn't break you. It teaches you. Your brain learned to recover, to adapt, to recalibrate, to ask what now instead of why me. This created adults with an internal backbone, people who don't crumble at the first sign of discomfort, who don't spiral at minor setbacks, who don't expect life to protect them from difficulty. Finally, think about anticipation, the waiting, the TV episodes that came once a week, the holiday excitement that built for months, the new toy you saved for all summer. That kind of waiting strengthened a part of the psyche modern generations barely use, the ability to delay gratification, to sit inside anticipation without frustration, and to savor the moment when it finally arrived. All of these elements, the freedom, the risk, the boredom, the loneliness, the conflict, the failure, the waiting, braided together into something psychologists today are still trying to name. Call it resilience, call it intuition, call it independence, call it emotional durability. But for the people who lived it, it wasn't a theory. It was life. They were shaped by a decade that didn't cushion them, didn't protect them, didn't inflate them, and didn't hover over them. Instead, it forced them to grow, not quickly, but deeply. And beneath that calm competence they carry today lies the quiet truth. They didn't just survive the 1970s. The 1970s made them. But there's one more layer to the people who grew up in the 1970s, one that even they don't fully understand until much later in life. It shows up in the way they walk into a room and instinctively scan it, not for danger, but for familiarity, for energy, for imbalance, for the subtle cues the rest of the world seems to miss. Because growing up with so much unsupervised time didn't just teach them independence. It taught them something that quietly shaped the rest of their lives, the ability to adapt without losing themselves. Take the way they handle uncertainty. When things get chaotic, when plans fall apart, when life shifts unexpectedly, they don't panic the way modern minds do. They take a breath, gather themselves, and move. Not because they're fearless, but because they grew up solving small problems constantly. A broken toy, a ruined plan, a friend who got mad mid-game. There wasn't an adult hovering nearby to untangle the moment for them. So their brains learned to improvise, pivot, and shape new paths out of nothing. And decades later, it shows. They don't crumble at the first sign of discomfort. They don't expect solutions to fall out of the sky. They build them, the same way they built makeshift forts out of spare wood and imagination. And then there's the way they love. People who grew up in the 1970s learned affection in a world with fewer words and more gestures. Parents weren't posting about their emotional states on the internet. Friends weren't sending long paragraphs analyzing their feelings. You showed you cared by showing up, by riding your bike across town to check on someone, by knocking on your friend's door just to see if they wanted to hang out. And because love was expressed through presence rather than performance, emotional connections felt simpler, quieter, but deeper. That's why even now, they value the people who stand by them more than the ones who talk loudly. They were raised on loyalty, not theatrics, on sincerity, not spectacle. But the most fascinating part, the contradictions. This generation carries a strange blend of toughness and tenderness that modern psychology still struggles to fully map out. They're strong, resourceful, adaptable, yet incredibly nostalgic. They can handle solitude, yet they treasure connection. They're disciplined, yet deeply sentimental. Because when you grow up without endless distractions, without constant stimulation, without a world trying to impress you every 5 seconds, the smallest things root themselves into your memory. The old music you heard through a cracked radio speaker, the creak of your bike as you rode home at dusk, the way summer air felt on your skin during those endless, unstructured days. Those memories don't just sit in the mind, they live in the bones, and they shape how this generation sees the world. People often mistake their quiet confidence for coldness. They assume that because 1970s kids don't overshare or panic easily, they must be detached. But the truth is the opposite. Their emotional world is rich, layered, and steady, not loud. They don't need constant affirmation because their identity isn't built on fragile scaffolding. It's built on the thousands of private little victories from childhood, figuring out how to entertain themselves, solving arguments without intervention, learning when to speak and when to listen, knowing how to handle fear without collapsing under it. These weren't lessons taught in classrooms, they were carved into them by life itself. And as adults, this psychological blueprint shapes everything: their careers, their relationships, their worldview. In workplaces, they're the ones who stay calm when everyone else is spiraling, who ask practical questions when others are drowning in hypotheticals, who understand that not everything needs immediate reaction. Some problems simply need space. Some frustrations simply need time. This patience, this ability to let things breathe, is one of the rarest psychological strengths in today's overstimulated world. But to them, it's just common sense. It's how life always worked. In relationships, they prefer honesty that's steady rather than dramatic. They don't need grand declarations. They need consistency, reliability. Someone who understands that real connection is built in the quiet spaces, not in the performative ones. And when conflict happens, because it always does, they don't run from it or drown in it. They let the emotions settle, the way they used to settle into their bedroom after a bad day at school, staring at the ceiling until the feelings softened. They learned early on that emotions lose their power when you stop feeding them panic. So now, as adults, they navigate emotional storms without getting swept away. Even their fears are different. They're not afraid of being alone. They've always known how to be by themselves. They're not afraid of boredom. They see it as space to think. They're not afraid of uncertainty. They grew up adapting to it. What they truly fear, though, is something much deeper: losing the simplicity that shaped them. Losing a world where kids learn through experience rather than instruction. Losing a sense of groundedness that cannot be replicated by screens or schedules. And this fear quietly influences the way they raise their own children, the way they interact with modern life, the way they hold on to traditions that others might view as outdated. But here's the twist, and the dark psychology of it all. The very traits that make 1970s kids strong can also make them misunderstood. Their tolerance for discomfort can look like emotional distance. Their independence can look like stubbornness. Their calmness can look like apathy. Their nostalgia can look like longing for a world that no longer exists. And sometimes, without realizing it, they hold themselves to standards born from a childhood where struggle wasn't optional, it was expected. They push themselves through pain when they should slow down. They take on more than they should because they're wired to handle things alone. They swallow emotions because they grew up in a world where you sat with them quietly instead of expressing them loudly. They carry burdens silently, not because they want to, but because silence was how they learned to process life. There's strength in that, and cost. Resilience always has a price. But beneath all of this, there's something profoundly admirable about the people who grew up in the 1970s. They are grounded in a way few modern generations are. They understand balance without having to preach it. They built confidence, not through affirmation, but through action. They know how to find joy in small things because small things were all they had sometimes. They know how to endure because life subtly trained them to endure. They know the value of freedom because they were given just enough of it to learn responsibility, not recklessness. They know who they are not because someone told them, but because they had the space to discover it. And maybe that's the core of their psychology, the dark and the light intertwined. A generation shaped not by instruction, but by experience. Not by supervision, but by trust. Not by instant answers, but by time. And now, in a world that moves faster than ever, their quiet strength stands out even more. A reminder that resilience isn't built through comfort. Confidence isn't built through praise. Independence isn't built through protection. It's built through living, freely, imperfectly, and bravely, in a world that demanded you figure things out on your own. The people who grew up in the 1970s didn't just survive a different era. They carry that era within them, and the psychology it forged is something rare, powerful, and quietly extraordinary. But to truly understand the dark psychology woven into people who grew up in the 1970s, you have to look at the quiet undercurrents that shaped them, the ones no one talked about, because nobody back then had the language for it. Every generation inherits ghosts, unspoken rules, silent expectations, emotional blueprints that come from the culture surrounding them. And for 1970s kids, those ghosts were everywhere. They were in the way adults spoke in half-truths, in the way families handled conflict with closed doors and lowered voices, in the way parents believed emotions were something you managed privately, not something you aired out loud. You learned early that the world didn't revolve around your feelings. If you were upset, you handled it. If you were scared, you figured it out. If something felt unfair, you swallowed that lump in your throat and kept moving. Nobody rushed to decode your emotions or validate every discomfort. And while that created strength, it also created something deeper, something more complex, an instinct to endure silently, to carry burdens internally, to keep your emotional world tucked neatly behind a calm expression. This is the part of 1970s psychology people don't understand. They see the toughness, the resilience, the independence, but they don't see the way many learned to hold everything alone. And it didn't come from cruelty. It came from the emotional climate of the decade. Adults in the 1970s had grown up during war, economic uncertainty, societal shifts. They weren't taught emotional vocabulary. They weren't encouraged to go to therapy or open up or communicate through vulnerability. So they raised their children with the only tools they had: stoicism, self-sufficiency, a quiet, deal-with-it mentality. And 1970s kids absorbed that lesson like oxygen. They became experts at emotional containment, at appearing steady, even when the ground beneath them shook. But here's the interesting twist. That same emotional containment created some of the most self-aware, emotionally astute adults later in life. Why? Because when you have to organize your inner world without external help, you get good at it. You learn to sift through your own thoughts, evaluate your own reactions, understand your impulses without someone narrating them for you. Modern psychologists call this metacognition, thinking about your thinking. But for 1970s kids, it wasn't a skill to master. It was survival. Think about those nights when something at school bothered you, but there was no one you felt comfortable telling. You'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling fan, turning slowly in the dark, replaying the moment again and again until it lost its sharpness. You'd pick it apart, examine it, try to understand what you could have done differently. That internal processing became your default operating system. And while it made you strong, it also made you selective about who you open up to. You don't unload your feelings on just anyone. You measure people first, watch their reactions, test their consistency. Relationships don't come easy, not because you don't care, but because your trust isn't given cheaply. It's ironic, really. People often assume those who grew up with independence and minimal emotional guidance become distant or disconnected. But 1970s kids developed a different kind of closeness, one built on authenticity, not convenience. If someone from that generation lets you into their inner world, it's because they chose to, not because they needed to. They value depth over noise, presence over constant communication. They can go weeks without talking to a friend and still pick up the conversation where it left off, as if no time passed at all. And then there's the way the world itself shaped them. Not just the freedom, not just the boredom, but the sheer unpredictability of the times. Societal change wasn't a headline back then. It was the air you breathed. Economic uncertainty, shifting family roles, rising divorce rates, cultural revolutions. Kids in the 1970s grew up watching the adults around them navigate instability with gritted teeth and forced composure. And from that, they learned a quiet lesson. Instability doesn't mean chaos. You can function in uncertainty. You can adapt even when the rules change. You can keep going even when life doesn't make sense. This ability to anchor themselves internally, regardless of external circumstances, is one of the defining psychological traits of 1970s kids. And it's something modern generations struggle to grasp. Because today, everything is immediate. Immediate opinions, immediate validation, immediate panic. But people who grew up in the 1970s have a different rhythm. They don't respond instantly because they spent their childhoods thinking before reacting. They don't crumble at the first sign of pressure because they were raised to withstand discomfort. They don't assume every challenge is a catastrophe because they learned early that life isn't always meant to feel easy or soft or perfectly balanced. They're not emotionless. They're calibrated. And that calibration shows up in subtle ways. They notice things others overlook, the tension in someone's voice, the way a room feels before anyone speaks, the smallest shifts in behavior. Because when you grow up unsupervised, navigating social dynamics without guidance, you learn to read people with near instinctive precision. You become a quiet observer, someone who understands the undercurrent of a room better than the conversation happening in it. But beneath all that resilience, beneath all that independence, there's another truth people rarely acknowledge. Growing up fast, growing up free, growing up emotionally self-reliant, created a generation that sometimes forgets they're allowed to rest, allowed to be vulnerable, allowed to admit when they're struggling. They're excellent at carrying weight, but rarely ask for help with it. They're experts at enduring, but novices at receiving support. Not because they don't want it, but because their childhood taught them it wasn't an option. And yet, this same paradox, the coexistence of strength and quiet emotional hunger, is what gives them depth. It's what makes them empathetic, grounded, perceptive. They've lived through enough to know when someone else is hurting, even if they say they're fine. They don't need dramatic displays to recognize emotional truth. They pick up on the subtle shifts, the things left unsaid, the tone beneath the words. This is the dark psychology of the 1970s generation. Not dark as in sinister, but dark as in the unseen layers beneath their strength. A psychology built on freedom and danger, independence and isolation, resilience and silence. A psychology shaped by scraped knees and long afternoons, by boredom that turned into creativity, by solitude that turned into self-awareness, by failures that turned into grit. They carry the imprint of a time when the world moved slower, when childhood wasn't curated, when mistakes weren't padded or softened, and that imprint follows them into adulthood. It shows up in the way they solve problems calmly while others panic, in the way they stay grounded during chaos, in the way they don't need constant stimulation to feel alive, in the way they trust themselves more than circumstances, in the way they can sit in a quiet room without needing to escape their own thoughts, in the way they still, after all these years, possess a kind of internal steadiness that can't be taught, only lived. If anything, people who grew up in the 1970s are a reminder of something modern society has forgotten. That strength isn't built through constant comfort. That resilience doesn't come from protection. That creativity grows in silence, not stimulation. That emotional intelligence is learned through experience, not explanation. That independence is forged in moments when you have no choice but to rely on yourself. And maybe that's why, even decades later, they stand out. Not because their childhood was better or worse than anyone else's, but because it created a psychological blueprint that the modern world doesn't produce anymore. One shaped by freedom, sharpened by risk, softened by solitude, strengthened by struggle, and deepened by everything they had to figure out on their own. And then there was the part no one talks about, the quiet psychological armor that formed in the background of nearly every 1970s childhood. It didn't come from life lessons or dramatic speeches. It came from tiny, invisible moments that felt insignificant at the time but built something permanent under the surface. Moments like sitting in the back seat of a car with no seatbelt, window cracked just enough for the wind to whistle, while your parents talked in the front seat about things you only half understood. You weren't the center of the universe. You weren't the star of the family narrative. You were simply there, absorbing the world without anyone filtering it for you. And that shaped a very specific kind of mind, one that learned to listen between the lines, to catch meaning in tone, to pay attention without being invited. People today underestimate how powerful that was. When you're not constantly affirmed or checked on, you start developing an internal compass instead of relying on external feedback. Kids back then learned to trust their gut, not because someone taught them to, but because they had to. When your stomach twisted about a situation, you didn't ask Google or text a group chat. You relied on instinct. And over time, that instinct sharpened into intuition, the kind that almost feels psychic when you're older. You can sense tension in a room before a word is spoken. You can predict how a situation will unfold because you've spent decades reading patterns humans don't even realize they show. But there was another layer too, something deeper and more complicated. Growing up in the 70s meant you saw your parents as human before you ever saw them as heroes. You watched your dad come home tired, slump into a chair, and not talk about his day, because that's how people coped back then, silently. You saw your mom handle everything from bills to burnt dinners to emotional storms without breaking down or announcing it to the world. No one labeled their stress, no one identified their trauma, no one talked about mental health. They just survived. And as a kid in that era, you internalized that same quiet endurance. Not the healthiest form of strength, maybe, but a real one. The ability to keep going even when life felt overwhelming. At the same time, this silent resilience had a shadow side. The dark psychology of the 1970s generation isn't just about independence and grit. It's about the emotional gaps that formed because no one taught you what to do with the feelings you swallowed. When you felt scared, you hid it. When you felt sad, you pushed it down. When you wanted comfort, you often didn't ask for it because you weren't sure if you were supposed to need it. This created adults who are capable, resourceful, strong, yes, but also adults who sometimes struggle to let people in, who default to solitude even when they crave connection, who cope by doing rather than talking because emotional vulnerability wasn't part of the world they grew up in. Still, this generation learned empathy in a raw, unspoken way. You didn't talk about emotions, you observed them. You learned to comfort a friend not with big, dramatic gestures, but with presence, sitting next to them, offering a distraction, making them laugh. The psychological imprint this left is subtle but powerful. 1970s kids became adults who show love through action over words, stability over sentiment, consistency over intensity. And in a world that's increasingly focused on validation, attention, and instant expression, this quiet kind of emotional strength stands out like a relic from a different universe. Yet, maybe the most fascinating part of this generation's psychology is how they handle fear. Growing up without constant adult supervision meant you had to face the world's uncertainties early. The creepy house on the corner, the older kids who might chase you, the dark basement, the strange noises outside at night. You didn't have Google telling you what was safe or what wasn't. You figured it out. Your fear response was trained not by warnings, but by experiences. And because of that, you became an adult who doesn't spiral in the face of the unknown. You don't panic when plans fall apart. You don't freeze when confronted with a problem that doesn't have an immediate answer. Your brain learned decades ago that fear is just a signal, not a stop sign. But the part almost nobody acknowledges is how deeply this era shaped your identity. In the 70s, you weren't constantly documenting your life. You weren't curating an online self. You weren't comparing your every move to strangers on a screen. Your identity formed internally, not externally. You discovered what you liked because you tried things, not because they were trending. You learned who you were from the inside out. That internal identity, once cemented, becomes unshakable. It's why so many people from this era have a groundedness, a sense of self that doesn't waver every time life shifts. Yet beneath all this strength, there's a softer truth, one often hidden under layers of independence and practicality. People who grew up in the 1970s learned early that life wasn't always comfortable, predictable, or gentle. And because of that, they developed an emotional armor that helped them thrive. But inside that armor sits a kind of nostalgia, a yearning for a world that moved slower, felt safer, and allowed for imperfection. A world where boredom sparked imagination, where mistakes weren't catastrophes, where resilience was a byproduct of living, not something you had to read a self-help book to develop. And that is the quiet, powerful, and dark psychology of those who grew up in the 1970s. A generation shaped not by supervision or structure, but by freedom, risk, solitude, patience, and the unspoken rules of a world that demanded strength long before they realized they had it. But there's one more thing about people who grew up in the 1970s that often gets overlooked. Something quieter, deeper, almost invisible, unless you know how to look for it. It's the way they learned to hold two worlds in their minds at the same time, the world they lived in and the world they imagined. Because without endless screens telling them what to think or how to feel, their inner world had room to bloom in ways that feel almost foreign today. Think about a 1970s bedroom at night. No TV buzzing in the background, no glowing phone lighting up their face, no constant stream of notifications demanding attention. Just the soft hum of the house settling, the faint sound of a car passing outside, and their own thoughts. That was it. That was the whole universe after the lights went out. So they lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in their head, imagining what tomorrow might look like, creating entire worlds out of nothing but their own mind. This wasn't boredom. This was introspection, something most people don't even realize they've lost. And because their minds weren't constantly pulled in 1,000 directions, they learned something powerful: how to finish a thought, how to sit with an idea long enough for it to turn into something meaningful, how to get comfortable with silence without needing to fill it. That's why so many of these individuals grew into adults who can have deeper conversations, who can really listen, who don't need loudness to feel alive. Their emotional rhythm was shaped by the pace of a world that allowed people to feel instead of react. But there's another layer, one that only the people who lived through it really understand. The world felt bigger back then, not because it was safer or simpler, but because it was mysterious. You couldn't Google the answer to everything. You couldn't track people's locations or instantly verify rumors. You had to wonder. You had to think. You had to ask questions and wait for answers that didn't always come quickly. You learned that not everything needed to be known right away, that uncertainty wasn't a problem to be solved, but a part of life. This shaped a kind of psychological patience that feels almost ancient now. And that patience didn't just exist in moments of quiet. It existed in moments of connection, too. Because when someone called your house and asked if you could come outside, that was your friend making an effort. When someone showed up at your door unexpectedly, that was how closeness worked. When someone said they'd meet you somewhere at a certain time, you trusted them enough to show up and wait. There were no texts to confirm, no apps to track, no instant excuses. Relationships depended on reliability. Promises actually meant something, and that sense of follow-through became part of who they were. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the psychology of 1970s kids is how they learned to navigate fear. Not the dramatic kind, but the subtle kind. Walking home at dusk when the sky turned purple and the streetlights flickered on one by one. That long stretch between the last corner and their front door, when the shadows looked a little too long and every sound felt louder than usual. They kept walking anyway, not because they weren't scared, but because they knew how to manage fear without collapsing under it. That matters more than people realize, because fear management builds confidence, and confidence built through experience becomes unshakable. The adults they became aren't fearless, They just learned early that fear doesn't mean stop. It means pay attention. It means think clearly. It means trust yourself. That's a psychological muscle many people today never had the chance to develop. And yet, despite this resilience, there's also a softness to many people who grew up in the 1970s. A softness born from a life that demanded independence but also offered freedom. They remember a world where friendships weren't filtered through screens, where conversations weren't shortened into emojis, where laughter echoed through backyards at dusk and every summer felt like an entire lifetime. That nostalgia isn't just sentimental, it's psychological grounding. It gives them a sense of continuity, a thread that ties who they were to who they are now. And this matters deeply because people who grew up in the 1970s carry something inside them that the modern world tries so hard to replace with apps, shortcuts, and constant stimulation. A sense of rootedness, a sense of knowing themselves, a sense of having lived in a world that didn't try to define them before they figured out who they were. Maybe that's why so many of them look at today's world with a kind of quiet disbelief. Not judgment, not rejection, just a deep understanding that things weren't always this fast, this loud, this overwhelming. They know what it feels like to live without being constantly watched or measured. They know what it feels like to trust their instincts, their judgment, their ability to figure things out. And they know what it feels like to truly be alone with their thoughts, without fear. And maybe that's the hidden dark psychology of it all. Not dark in the sense of something sinister, but dark in the sense of something hidden, something powerful, something forged in silence and freedom rather than noise and control. A psychology built not by constant supervision, but by earned wisdom. Not by curated identities, but by lived experience. Not by algorithms, but by reality. It's the quiet confidence of people who grew up in a world that asked more of them, gave them less structure, and in doing so, gave them something priceless. An inner stability that can't be downloaded, purchased, or taught in a classroom. And that stability didn't just make them strong, it made them grounded. It made them observant. It made them self-reliant in ways the modern world barely recognizes anymore. Because when you grow up in the 1970s, you don't just remember a different time, you carry it. And it shapes the way you move through the world, quietly, confidently, and with a depth that only comes from living life unsupervised. And yet, even after everything they learned in those years, there's one part of the 1970s experience that shaped them more quietly than the scraped knees, the long walks home, or the empty afternoons. It was the way the world itself felt back then, slower, less filtered, a little unpredictable, and completely uninterested in cushioning your edges. That environment carved something into them that never really left, an ability to live in reality without constantly trying to escape it. Think about the nights when the power went out. No screens, no noise, no endless stream of entertainment humming in the background, just darkness, candles, maybe a flashlight that barely worked. In that darkness, you didn't panic. You found a board game, told ghost stories, or simply sat there listening to the quiet hum of a house settling into itself. Modern life teaches us that silence is something to be filled, but silence taught this generation how to listen, how to think, how to just be without needing distraction. That small, simple skill became a psychological superpower later in life. They don't crumble when things get quiet. They don't panic when there's nothing to do. They don't need noise to feel alive. And the world around them wasn't sanitized. They saw things kids today would never be allowed near. The drunk neighbor arguing with his wife on the porch. The older teenagers smoking behind the school. The news playing in the background without filters or parental controls. They learned early that life could be messy, unfair, confusing, and occasionally frightening, and that it didn't mean the world was ending. It just meant the world was real. They developed a tolerance for ambiguity, a psychological steadiness that comes from understanding that not every bad moment is a crisis. Not every problem requires intervention. Not every uncomfortable feeling needs to be eliminated. Then there were the objects, the tangibility of life. Phones mounted to walls with cords that stretched across hallways, books with dog-eared pages, toys that broke and had to be fixed with tape or glue. When something stopped working, you didn't replace it. You sat down, examined it, and tried to understand how it functioned. Without realizing it, this built a kind of cognitive patience, a willingness to troubleshoot rather than abandon. It taught them that frustration is part of the process, not a sign to give up, and that instinct lives on. These adults don't pause their lives for inconvenience, they push through it. But nothing shaped them quite like the relationships forged without technology. Friendship wasn't maintained through messages or likes. If you wanted to see someone, you went to their house and knocked. If they weren't home, you accepted it. No anger, no overthinking, no spiraling into insecurity. It taught them that connection wasn't about constant access. It was about presence, about effort, about showing up physically and emotionally when it mattered. This built a generation that values loyalty over frequency, quality over convenience, sincerity over speed. They don't need daily reassurance to feel connected. They understand that real relationships survive silence. And when conflicts happened, and they did, they were handled face to face. There was no hiding behind screens, no typing out emotions and hoping they landed correctly. You looked someone in the eyes, felt the heat of your own embarrassment or anger, and navigated your way through it. That discomfort trained them to handle confrontation with grace, to stay calm, to understand tone, expression, timing. It's why many 1970s kids grew up to be adults who rarely overreact. They learned early that most problems shrink, not grow, when handled directly. Even the way they consumed culture shaped them psychologically. Music wasn't infinite. Movies weren't on demand. You listened to the same album until you wore it out. You watched the same movies every time they aired. You waited months for new releases. This created emotional depth, an ability to sit with something long enough to understand it, to let it sink in, to attach memories and meaning to it. They didn't chase the next thing constantly. They didn't skim through experiences. They savored them. They experienced repetition without boredom and familiarity without contempt. And it wired their brains to appreciate what they have, not obsess over what they don't. But the most powerful shaping force came from something so subtle it almost goes unnoticed, the belief that adults weren't always right and institutions weren't always trustworthy. The 1970s were messy, economically, politically, socially. These kids grew up watching society question itself. They heard adults argue about politics on the news. They saw cultural shifts happening around them in real time. And instead of being shielded from it, they absorbed it, not in a cynical way, but in a grounded one. They learned to think for themselves, to question, to evaluate, to trust their own judgment. This created adults who can navigate misinformation, manipulation, and uncertainty with clarity. They don't fall for everything they hear. They don't crumble when someone disagrees with them. They don't outsource their thinking to anyone. All of this formed a psychological foundation that is nearly impossible to replicate today. Freedom built their confidence. Boredom sharpened their creativity. Risk calibrated their judgment. Solitude strengthened their emotional stability. Failure shaped their resilience. Slowness cultivated their patience. Reality taught them discernment. And together, these forces created a generation of people who are, in many ways, uniquely adapted to handle the chaos of modern life. Because ultimately, the dark psychology of people who grew up in the 1970s isn't dark in the sinister sense. It's dark in the sense that it was forged in the shadows, in the unseen moments, in the spaces where no one was watching, in the quiet, unstructured, unfiltered world that shaped them more profoundly than they ever realized. And that's why, even now, they stand out. Not because they had it harder, but because they learned to adapt, endure, and understand life on a level that today's fast-paced, hyper-supervised world rarely allows. And yet, even after all these years, there's one part of the 1970s childhood experience that most people overlook entirely, a part that shaped these individuals far more than the forts, the scraped knees, or the endless afternoons of boredom ever did. It's the way the world itself felt back then. Not just slower, not just quieter, but bigger, in a way that today's hyper-shrunk digital landscape can't even imitate. Because when you grew up in the 1970s, the world wasn't at your fingertips. You couldn't zoom in on any location instantly, couldn't look up the answer to every question, couldn't verify every rumor or break every mystery in seconds. So you developed something incredibly rare, a tolerance for the unknown, a comfort with ambiguity, a relationship with curiosity that wasn't satisfied instantly. It was fed, nurtured, allowed to stretch its legs. When you heard a strange sound outside at night, you didn't Google it. You lay there listening, imagining possibilities as your brain wandered into the shadows. When a mystery unfolded at school, a teacher whispering with the principal, a strange car parked near the playground, your mind filled in the blanks. Not in an anxious, catastrophic way, but in an imaginative, open way. You weren't trained to fear the unknown, you were trained to explore it. And that exploration extended far beyond physical spaces. It shaped how these individuals approach uncertainty in adulthood. While modern generations panic when life veers off script, when a job becomes unstable, when someone's tone sounds different, when a relationship enters gray areas, 1970s kids lean into uncertainty with an almost uncanny calmness. They aren't thrown by not knowing. They're not paralyzed by loose ends. Their brains grew in an environment where answers didn't arrive in milliseconds, so they learned that waiting, observing, wondering was part of the process, sometimes even the best part. But the dark psychology of growing up in the 1970s isn't just about resilience or tolerance. It's also about the shadows that silence created, because there were no online communities to compare yourself to. No algorithms showing you thousands of people living better, doing more, succeeding faster. If you felt insecure, you sat with it. If you thought you weren't good enough, you didn't see endless content confirming it. You looked inward, not outward. And sometimes that silence was healing. Other times it carved little cracks inside that didn't get repaired until much later. The 1970s taught you to internalize, sometimes too much. When something went wrong, you assumed the solution was within you. If you were hurt, you worked through it alone. If you were confused, you tried to make sense of it with the tools you had. That forged strength, yes, but it also forged emotional stoicism that could feel like isolation. Many of these individuals grew up to become adults who seem unshakable, but they struggle to articulate their inner world because they were never taught how. They learned competence before communication, durability before vulnerability. And yet, it created a generation with a rare psychological trait: emotional endurance. Not just the ability to survive emotional storms, but to do so quietly, without broadcasting every internal shift. They learned to hold their feelings like stones in their pockets, not to deny them, but to carry them until they wore smooth. Still, the world they grew up in didn't just demand independence, it demanded adaptability. Because information moved slowly, but life moved quickly. Plans changed without notice. Parents worked late without texting. Weather shifted without apps predicting the hour. Friends knocked on your door instead of scheduling hangouts 2 weeks out. Every day required flexibility. You didn't grow up expecting consistency. You grew up expecting life to unfold however it wanted, and you followed. This led to one of the most unique traits of people raised in the 1970s: grounded spontaneity. They're not reckless, they're responsive. They're not impulsive, they're fluid. They can pivot without panicking. They can create structure when needed, but aren't imprisoned by it. Their childhood taught them to adapt because rigidity wasn't an option. The world wasn't padded for them. They had to mold themselves to it. But perhaps the darkest, yet most beautiful, part of 1970s psychology shows up in how these individuals love. Because love, back then, wasn't text messages, heart emojis, or constant updates. It was presence. It was showing up when it mattered, because there were no shortcuts. It was riding your bike across town to apologize. It was waiting days to talk something out face to face. It was missing someone so deeply it physically ached, because absence wasn't instantly fixable. So when 1970s kids love today, they love differently. They love with patience, with longevity, with effort, with attention. They know connection isn't disposable or easily replaced. They know that affection isn't proven through constant communication, but through consistent action. They grew up valuing depth over noise, substance over stimulation, people over convenience. And that kind of love, grounded, steady, and quiet, can feel almost intimidating in a world obsessed with speed. But behind that strength is another shadow. Many 1970s kids grew up believing they had to earn connection. that they had to be useful to be wanted, that love wasn't guaranteed, it was cultivated. This created adults who give everything and ask for nothing, until eventually something inside them whispers that maybe they deserved more softness than they allowed themselves to receive. This is the unspoken ache many carry, even now. But despite all the contradictions, all the light and shadow fused together, people who grew up in the 1970s share one psychological signature above all others: a selfhood built from the inside out, not shaped by social media, not defined by trends, not sculpted by constant comparison. Their identity wasn't a performance, it was a quiet construction, brick by brick, mistake by mistake, moment by moment. They grew up in a decade that didn't just build resilience, it built character. A decade that didn't teach them who to be, it taught them how to become. And now, in a world that feels frantic, overstimulated, and emotionally fragile, this generation stands as living evidence that sometimes the hardest, roughest, least curated childhoods create the strongest, most grounded adults. Because the dark psychology of growing up in the 1970s is ultimately this: strength wasn't taught to them, it was built inside them. And once something is built inside you, it can never be taken away.